Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt Zaun. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. I'm so excited for you to hear this conversation because this episode is part of a Launch, Grow, Thrive series with Dr. John Wilson. For those of you who might not be familiar with John, he is an entrepreneur, a professor at Drexel University, and the host of Entre Professor. But more importantly, it is an honor and privilege to call him a business mentor and a friend. Let's dive in. John, welcome back to the Stories of Traction podcast.
Thanks, Matt. It's great to be back.
I appreciate your time and I appreciate your willingness to dive into a series with us. So the series Launch, Grow, Thrive, really tying into what you do for different companies. The very first episode, we dove into the elements of launch, how someone launches a product, service into the world. The second episode, which was the last episode, we went into the grow phase and what the grow phase looked like. And you shared three specific things with me that I really walked away from the episode remembering. The very first one is you talked about people getting out of their business. You said, let go, and focusing on hiring a strong number two. That was the COO. The second point is you mentioned the CEO needs to empower, equip, and release the COO and work together in order to do that, that it's a process. It's not quick, but it happens. It's a journey, right? It's a series of time to get them to that point. And then the third and final piece was that COO identifying 5 to 10 people in an organization that they would consider indispensable and how dangerous that is in the event that one or a few of those people walk, and creating a system built around that individual so that they can continue to grow based on those systems. So I appreciate you diving into the grow phase. Now I want to tackle the thrive phase within that launch, grow, thrive. So a company does everything that you mentioned last episode regarding grow. Now they're ready to transition into thrive. So can you give us a definition of what it means for a business to truly be thriving?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I would say about thrive is not so much about the business as it is the business owner, the founder, that person that has either started the business and built it up to what it is today, or they came into the business as a leader or bought the business at a certain point, but then transformed it and really either grew it to new heights, or they transformed it and changed its direction in some way. And thrive is as much about that person as it is the business itself. Because in some ways, it's like once the business is really, truly through grow mode, and to me, it's like you always want a company to be growing, but the growth stage of the company is really putting an infrastructure for it to grow substantially and to become self-sustaining. And self-sustaining is when the business can not only run itself on operating on a day-to-day basis, but it's also looking ahead and expanding and increasing its reach, its impact, and all those kinds of things. And it's doing that in a self-sustaining way. But then it's for the business owner, what does the next step look like to them? Are they able to sell the business? Are they able to retire? Are they able to just even run the business, but also do the things that they want to do in life? And a lot of times I find owners get the business to this place where it's running on its own, but they are actually not enjoying the benefit of it by being able to invest in the things that they love to do most, to be able to invest their time with family, or to be able to think about options beyond being the person running or owning the business.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the identity piece. And it's bringing back a memory podcast-wise that I had. This is years ago, but it was episode 84. It was with a gentleman named Jacob Brown. The episode is called Always Fall Forward. And this gentleman was an NFL athlete, ends up getting cut from the NFL. So imagine this. Phenomenal college athlete, gets in the small, minute pool of athletes that are superior in college, go on to the NFL, gets on his dream team, and then eventually gets cut from the NFL. And his life literally spirals out of control. I mean, he goes through depression. He ends up picking up a drinking problem. He goes through a lot of this in the episode, and the battles that he had to face, because his entire identity was tied up in him being a professional athlete. And I'll never forget, in the episode, he says something in particular that I'll never forget. He said, "Matt, I felt like I was a football player, not that I was a person that played football. I was a football player. And when football went bye-bye, his life, unfortunately, felt like it was going bye-bye too." Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to talk about that, because what you mentioned really speaks to the identity piece about an owner. Maybe they've been in the business 20, 30 years. They've built the business. They've grown the business. They're profitable. They've done it. They have it. They have the house. They have the lake house. They have the boat. They have all the shiny objects. On the outside, they look successful, but yet they feel concerned that if they walk away, that their entire identity is going to be ripped from the frame. So can you talk to us about specific elements of identity when it comes to that owner in the business?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're spot on, Matt. I run into that very frequently when I find this time of I want to thrive, and a lot of times it's what presents first is the owner wants to get the business to a place where they can have freedom. They want to be able to travel. They want to be able to spend time with family. They may want to do some new projects, those kinds of things. And so that freedom is easy because that's all the things I'd like to do that I'm not doing. But it's that identity piece, that second part, that can be the hardest. And in fact, I've even found times where I've been working with an owner trying to get a business ready to sell, whether they're ready to sell it or not, but getting a business ready to sell. And things are going along at a good pace. And then all of a sudden, things start to slow down and they almost like drag their feet. And what I'm finding the common thread is it's not that they've lost interest. It's not that they aren't committed to the idea. It's all of a sudden they start to bump up against the identity crisis that leaving the business is going to represent. And it could be that the identity crisis is, I'm not going to be the CEO anymore. I'm not going to be the owner anymore. Or anything like that. It's like you said, it's that they're not a person who owns the business. They're not a person who built the business or a person who runs the business. They're seeing themselves as, I am a CEO. And if they stop being a CEO, they lose some part or even the main part of themselves. That fear can manifest in a lot of different ways, and it's not even always obvious to them that that's what is causing them to pause in what they're working towards.
Yeah, I was in a conversation, I believe it was a year ago now, her name's Lorraine Wiseman, and she was sharing, there's a powerful conversation where basically, so this woman's a leader of leaders. She works with a lot of CEOs, primarily founders that end up being CEOs. And she said that there's some troubling data coming out now, particularly with baby boomers, where they feel that they can't retire because of that identity piece. And what was even more horrifying was she shared some suicide stats, where incredibly troubling, where basically someone even reaching the quote unquote peak of success in the business world, they end up leaving their business. And then there's major depression that comes in. They feel that they've completely lost their way and purpose in life. And there's a lot of data that points to horrifying suicide numbers based on that. She said the only thing that we have regarding specific research on this is people returning from war. She basically said that there's different elements of people that are in war zones. They come home and they don't even know how to properly function in society again, and how they're trying to use this specific research and how to get people back into becoming more like civilians based on how do you get someone that their entire identity 20, 30 years was tied up into a business. Now they leave. How do they do that disconnect? She said there's very little research based on this. So I thought it was fascinating that now they're kind of diving into elements of the research of soldiers in war. How do they get back into society? I know that's quite the quite the difference between war and business, but it really goes down. It goes back to that identity piece, that really important identity piece. So from an identity piece perspective, how do you get them to pass the baton? Is it a specific strategic transition where instead of just like cutting the rope. It might be like a 6-month process or a year process. How would you coach someone to set themselves up for having a positive legacy?
Yeah. Well, and that is where I often become a little bit almost as much a life coach as a business coach at this stage of the process, because it is really helping someone to think about what their identity is beyond the business. And, sometimes that can be difficult because so much of their time and attention is on the business that it's hard to think of themselves in other ways. That's almost one of the toughest challenges of, what's next. In fact, gotten to know someone who's becoming a good friend named Jeff Teschke, who spent 17 years developing a business called Forge 3. And the focus was on insurance companies. It was basically building websites for insurance companies and did a subscription model. And it was not even intended to be the business he wanted to found. He was trying to be the founder of these really splashy tech startups, and a couple of them failed, and he ended up doing something very simple, but it became very successful. Once the value proposition, the customer was figured out, put in very highly repeatable systems, put in a really strong number two, the business was literally running itself to the point that he was unnecessary. And the moment came when there were 3 other companies in the space, and they all were getting just trounced on by his business that was running itself self-sustainably. And they all realized he was ready to sell the business, and they got into a bid war. And he was able to sell the business for an enormous amount of money, undisclosed amount. But, really in a situation where he didn't have to work again. And unlike most businesses, most times business owner is not successful at getting themselves completely out of the business. And then they get caught in what's called an earnout when they sell the business, which is to say they still have to stay for a period of time. They actually have to continue to grow the business for a certain amount of time, or they don't get all their payouts that they agreed to. And in this case, he likened it was like we were all on a cruise ship together. And one day I climbed into a lifeboat, was lowered into the water, and the cruise ship went on without me. And so, he was able to, do those things. He got that freedom. He could do the things he wanted to do. He was able to spend time with his family. He was able to support his spouse getting off in the kind of the next level of her career, and, do some things that he really wanted to do that way. But after a few years of just kind of settling in, he's really thinking about, what am I going to do with kind of the next half of my career? Because I'm not ready to be done yet. He still has young kids, and he wants to really do something more. He's realizing I need an identity beyond this company that I built and sold. And so he's launched a website called whatsnextjeff.com, and he's sharing his journey with the world of how he will test out different things he may do with the next phase of his life. And it's just a really great example of separating identity and then finding what identity is beyond just this business that is, maybe either not part of their life anymore, or soon will not be. Your statistic around, the sobering statistics here, I think, matched with this other interesting statistic. One study found that, or estimates, about 210,000 baby boomer owned businesses are going to transfer ownership each year between now and 2030. So there's really a time happening in the world right now where a lot of people spent their whole life building this legacy or building this business, and now they're going to transfer that ownership in the next few years.
Yeah, that's absolutely wild, because it's almost like someone becomes so a part of their business. It's almost like they become like a machine, so to speak, in their business, where they lose sight of what life is like after. So what would be some core focuses for someone to say, hey, they asked that question, what is your identity beyond the business? What are some things that you would steer them towards focusing on regarding those identity pieces?
Sure. I really feel like the first thing is a journey of what I'll call just self-awareness or self-knowledge. As the Latin expression is always translated, know thyself. It's really understanding not just what do I like to do? Because I think a lot of times people think of, I like to golf, I like to travel, I like to do these things. A lot of times, someone who's spent so much time just pouring their life into a business, and maybe the people around them that are running that business haven't taken the time to really understand themselves in a way, like what makes me tick. I really have been very strong on using some kind of diagnostic method to figure out like what are your real core strengths, what are your natural abilities, what is your real disposition as a person, and not just the kind of the pop culture personality tests like Enneagram or Strengths Finder or Myers-Briggs, those kinds of things. But I have found a mechanism called the Highlands Abilities Battery that really gets into the psychology of a person in terms of their abilities and the way they work, and not just asking some questions, what do you think about yourself? But they have to go in and actually do work type activities in a timed box situation where they're feeling pressure and stress. And it actually reveals the things that are the greatest strengths and the greatest abilities. And when you match that with life kind of circumstance and life goals and ambitions, it can be really powerful in helping to map out a journey for what is life going to look like after this. You described the example of like for the football player, like what is life after football? What is life look like after being an owner or a president or CEO or a founder? So these are some of the things that I find are really helpful in that self-analysis and really set the stage for, figuring out what the next stage of the journey is.
It sounds so simple. It sounds almost like naturally everyone should be able to figure this out. Why is it so difficult to figure this out, especially for high achievers? Because someone would need to be a type A high achiever to even get to this point. Where do you think the bottleneck is regarding this line of thinking?
Yeah. Well, I think part of that type A personality is just making the emotional, personal attachment to the role and making that the identity. And there's certain expectations of these types of roles. You might call it a cult of personality. Someone steps into the systems to be an effective president, CEO, owner, leader. They've created a culture and they have to operate a certain way to kind of project the right image in that culture and those kinds of things. And so in a lot of ways, that could mean that their identity isn't their own true identity. It's the identity that they've cultivated to be able to be as successful as they have. One of the earlier podcasts, we talked about that almost like imposter syndrome or that anxiety of like, maybe I'm not really worthy. And, it's like, and so, well, okay, we've kind of created images of everything is fine, or I'm really strong in these areas. But if they're not really aligned with the true natural self, the true natural abilities, the true personality, that can, kind of contribute to this personality and identity crisis when they start to think about, I'm not going to be known as this top person anymore, known as the leader, known as the owner.
Yeah, you bring up a fascinating point, one that I want to process through a little bit more. So the first thing I thought of was identity management, right? We're basically like almost becoming an actor. Not that we're trying to deceive or manipulate, but especially for someone that's growing a business, like we need to play certain parts and get into that mindset. So for people that are growing a business, maybe they don't really like sales, but they're playing the part of a sales rep because they have to get sales under their belt to bring other sales reps on board to grow the company. So they're playing the part of that sales rep. And maybe in one instance, they need to play the part of marketing so that they can help their marketing department. And then they need to work with their HR manager to play the part of how do we have really good onboarding sessions. So now they're playing that part. So there's an element of like acting that goes into it. Again, not to manipulate or deceive, but just doing what they need to do to get stuff done. Yeah. So this really speaks to the legacy of it, right? So after like they're getting in the mindset of legacy, what comes after the business, would you say that nonprofit work is a really good transition after business? Is that a place where a lot of individuals in this stage of life start?
Yeah, I think nonprofit work can be a great way to explore that identity and to expand that identity. But I would not say that's like everyone should do that. That may not be for everyone. Some people aren't wired that way. And to try to force themselves into that box might just be even more more disruptive than trying to, start another business, even because it's so foreign. To me, one of the things, I often like to ask people the $10 million question, or, if it's someone who's been really successful, the $100 million question, if you kind of could take money off the table as any kind of confining factor, what would you do? And I always think I find it interesting. Some of the first answers people say will be the thing they think they're supposed to say. They'd be like, "Oh, I'd give a lot of it to charity," and like, so I'll follow up a question like that. So, what charities do you donate your time and money to now? And surprisingly few people answer that in a way of like, yeah, oh, this much, or they a lot of times will say, well, once I make it big, I'll volunteer, or I'll donate money, or those kinds of things. So to me, I would say if someone's thinking about being involved in a nonprofit or philanthropy or do some kind of social impact work, the first question I would say is, what have you always been doing in that space? And if the answer is nothing, well, then, maybe that's not the place to start. To quote you, I remember at one point saying, telling the story about, instead of saying, I don't have time for something, say, I don't care about that thing. It's like, if that's not something someone's already had an interest in or invested in, that's probably not the best thing to start with. Now, that said, I think philanthropy and volunteerism and nonprofit work is an awesome idea. And I think if someone hasn't done that in their life, they should explore it. But the first thing might be to explore something that's close to home or familiar before diving into something that's very different and foreign.
Brings up going deeper with someone's why, right? Asking that question, why? And
Yeah.
you and I have a mutual friend, Alyssa Di Natale. And so years ago, when I was really struggling with my weight and I was up and down, and quick side note, so I've had eating issues over the years based on my wrestling. I wrestled for 10 years. So as I'm sure people listening can imagine, there's a lot of cutting weight. And then I played football too. So I was an offensive lineman, and then I had to cut down to a certain point for wrestling. So it really messed me up when it came to eating and dieting and being fit. So I reached out to Alyssa Di Natale, and I asked her, like, help coach me on how to lose weight and keep it off. And I'll never forget, she immediately asked, why do you want to lose weight? So, and this is a fitness coach, right? So like someone that makes money off of helping people lose weight. So she didn't say, yeah, here's a plan. Here's this, here's that. Why do you want to lose weight? And then she went multiple layers deep with that why. I'll never forget this, right? Why do you want to lose weight? I'll have more energy. Why is having more energy important? I'll be able to produce more results for my clients and maybe stay awake during meetings. I'll never forget. She said, why is producing results for your clients important? I'm passionate about showing leaders how to persuade with power through the art of strategic storytelling so they can live more fulfilled lives. Why do you want your clients to achieve their goals? So then we dive deeper. And for me, it was, I struggled with communication for years. I was a horrific communicator. And then I learned specific strategies when it came to speech writing and storytelling. And I want people to not make the same mistakes that I made. And then she said, why is that important to you? And then basically the whole point is we got down to, not that I want to lose weight, but that I want to provide for my family and offer them experiences and memories that I didn't have growing up. So it was almost like she went from, I want to lose weight, to something going much, much, much deeper. And that's always stuck with me, because now I've become a lot more holistic in my approach to fitness and weight loss, that it's not just losing a couple pounds on a scale. Believe it or not, I haven't stepped on a scale in over a year. I don't care how much I weigh. It's really about that energy being present for my kids. It went much deeper. So as you're saying this, John, I almost feel like it's basically not what's on the surface, not something someone's going to blurt right out of their mouth when you say, all right, what are the next steps regarding that nonprofit, that charity? But how do they get to the root of that? How do they get to the core of that? So I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that 5 whys is such an interesting mechanism for getting to the root cause of things. There's the whole body of work around what they call root cause analysis. In entrepreneurship, which I teach, we do customer development, customer discovery, where you're trying to empathize and understand customers. And asking those 5 whys does exactly what you just described, which is get beneath the thing that's presenting as this is why, because that's probably just a symptom of other things that go deeper. And so the more that you ask why, you get to layers beyond the logical, layers beyond the practical. You start to get into the emotional, the psychological, just the what is it that's really the driving force behind that. And that's where I say, like, Thrive is often more life coaching than it is business coaching, because it's getting to that, what is it that you want from life? What is it you really want to accomplish from life? And the years you have left. One thing I talked a bit about Jeff Teskey earlier. Jeff shared with one of my classes, he put a box on the screen with a bunch of little boxes that went 1 through 78. And he asked the students, what does this represent? What do you think this represents? And after several guesses, someone in the back of the room finally said, it looks like the average lifespan of a human. And he's like, exactly. 78 years is the average lifespan of a human. And so when you think of it in those terms, it's like, how many of those years do you have left? And how do you want to invest those? And when it comes to time, I like to ask the question, are you wasting time? Are you spending time? Are you investing time? And when you only have a certain number of years left, hopefully you have a lot more than 78. But at the same time, it's like, knowing there's a finite number there, do you have a real clear idea on what it is that you want to get from those, or what do you want to be that life experience?
Wow, that's powerful. That 1 to 78. It's kind of scary too when you start calculating where you are within that 1 to 78. So I do want to dive a little bit more into the root cause analysis that you mentioned. That's fascinating. And I want to mention this because I feel often in business, we're much more willing to talk about innovation versus creativity. This always amazes me when I come in, especially when I come into companies and I do strategic storytelling workshops, and companies want all of these magnificent inspirational stories to flow out of them. It really starts with that creativity piece. They need to be willing to put themselves in a creative state to get these stories out. And for them, a lot of times it comes across as weird or silly, right? Because when you're in the draft phase, you need a surge of ideas. And one of the ways that I do this is we set a timer on our phone, and I'll give them certain prompts, and I'll say, in the next 5 minutes, I just want you to continue to share ideas with me and topics in this time. And what's amazing is a lot of the CEOs that I work with, it's very difficult for them to do because they're so afraid of looking foolish, or they feel silly in that moment. But that's where the beauty happens. That's where they start to tap in their subconscious mind, and different topics and ideas and stories start flowing out of them. So based back to that root cause analysis, is there a certain exercise or a certain prompt or something that you would take someone through to get to the root cause of something? Like, what would be an exercise you would say, hey, we're going to do blank to try to get to the root cause of why you truly want to do something?
Yeah. Well, so the exercise really is that why, that questioning process. It's really digging in. I think the thing I have found is, it's one thing to say we're going to ask five times the why question, but it's almost like everybody wants to stay at the first level. So they'll find another way to stay at the first level. And I would say, if it's practical, if it's logical, it's first level. So someone might answer the why question 50 times, and you're still not really behind it. So, to me, it's getting to the implications behind what they say is the why. What is implied behind what they're saying, and helping them to dig into that more deeply. As an example, if someone says, I want more freedom, well, why is that? Well, because I feel kind of limited. Why are you feeling limited? Well, I just feel like every minute of my day is scheduled out for me. Why is that a problem? Well, because it means I can't do what I want to do when I want to do it. Why do you feel like you need that flexibility? It's like, well, I just feel like I'm a more spontaneous person, and I would like to do things that strike me in the moment. And yet I don't have any opportunity to do that because I've been scheduled by someone who's making me do all these meetings. I've hired this assistant to make sure that all my time is covered. And it's like, well, why do you want to be more spontaneous? It's like, I'm bored with life. And, it's like, wait a minute, bored with life. Well, what does that feel like when you feel bored with life? It's just like, I just feel like I'm on a hamster wheel running around in circles. And it's like, like all of a sudden, it's like the tone almost comes down, and you see, and, to me, I'm like, if someone's in tears, you're getting towards the root cause, it's
For sure. And what's interesting is you did that very quickly, John. You took us through that. Imagine if someone set a timer on their phone for 5 minutes and they continue to do that. Why, how deep they can get. We're only talking 5 minutes to get to the root of something. So I really appreciate what you said. You said, if it's practical, if it's logical, it's still first level. That's a powerful statement there. I appreciate you sharing that. And I also appreciate the time that you spent with us today. I really appreciate your time today. And I also appreciate the time that you spent over the course of this entire series. I appreciate diving into the Launch, Grow, Thrive. And particularly with this conversation, I'm going to have 3 specific takeaways. I appreciate you mentioning, you actually asked a powerful question. The question is, what is your identity beyond the business? I think that's something everyone should ask. What is your identity beyond the business that you are running? The second point is you mentioned self-awareness. I thought that was really important. You said self-awareness, and then you said, it's not what I like to do, it's what makes me tick. And then the third and final piece was that root cause analysis. I really appreciate you mentioning it's not the surfacey level stuff. We have to drive deeper to try to figure out where is someone actually coming from, what makes them tick, where's their identity, and ultimately transition them into that legacy piece. So I really appreciate everything that you shared with us today. And if someone wants to get more information on what you do, or they want to reach out to you for your services to help them in that thrive stage, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
Yeah, the best place to reach me is LinkedIn. I have all my contact information out there. You can also leave me a direct message and I'll get back to you from there.
Perfect. I will include that in the show notes. People could just click and go from there. And again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.